It is a Fairbanks Friday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Nick Fairbanks will be joining the show to give a little bit of a wellness check on the week that was for the Florida Panthers. And today's episode, because it is the week of free agency, we are going to give our way too early predictions based on the opening night lineup and the way too early predictions on who's going to make the playoffs, all on today's edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
Your Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
And welcome into this Friday, July 15th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're to your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez from PantherParkway.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at MondoMan12. Follow the show account on Twitter at LO_FLA Panthers. And thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. Don't forget to also subscribe to Locked On NHL and the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast with Flip Livingstone and Still Roden, where they'll be covering all the off-season activities around the National Hockey League. So, Cats fans, it's been still a strange week with the Florida Panthers when we've spoken about what we thought was going to be more moves and as far as keeping the upcoming free agents for the Florida Panthers. And the thing is, we can't change what already happened. And it's, sometimes you just got to move on. And it's unfortunate for the Panthers and for us as fans and everyone who covers the team. But it is a Fairbanks Friday edition of the show. Nick Fairbanks is off the IR. And he is ready to, and I just saw your band tee, Nick, Muse tee. I just saw it a little bit as you were adjusting yourself. So, Nick, welcome back off the IR.
Thank you for having me back, Armando. And it was a 2-week stint. I'm feeling great. And I have to rep Muse because they're actually going to be releasing a new song here in the next week that sounds killer. Sounds like their old stuff, and I'm really excited about it. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Panthers hockey and what could be opening night.
Well, so first of all, I want to get a wellness check out of you of the week that was for the Panthers. We were expecting a Hornquist trade. That didn't happen. We were hoping to keep at least one of Mason Marchment or Claude Drew, and none of those happens. I want to give you the floor for a little bit and what you think about losing both of them.
So it's a tough pill to swallow, obviously. I mean, if you had to choose between both players, to me, it was a toss-up because you have a wily veteran and Giroux that, basically helped the Panthers get through the first round for the first time in over 20 years, with his awesome pass over to Verhaeghe. But then you have a heart and soul guy who left it out on the ice every single shift in Mason Marchment, and condolences to him and his family over the passing of his father. It was a tough toss up to who you wanted to keep, but at the end of the day, Florida just wasn't able to make any moves as far as moving either Hornquist or, we've talked about it, moving Bobrovsky's contract or anything like that, or even Mackenzie Weegar. I'll just throw that out there, but some things sometimes don't happen. Something that you really can't, predict. But, here we are, and, we have to deal with what we have. And this is still a good playoff team. And we'll see if the top players are going to be able to step up and take the next step and help this franchise get to where it needs to go.
And going back to the core, they've had opportunities to learn from veterans who have made stops here. We spoke about Jaromir Jagr in 2016. Now we had Claude Giroux here in Sunrise for a half a season. And though they did have their shortcomings in this year. I think this is also an opportunity for these guys to kind of learn from this experience, and maybe this is a time for them to elevate even more. I mean, let's not forget that Barkov is entering his first year of his new deal and in the middle of his prime, and Huberdeau with a new contract. Of course, we saw a career season with Huberdeau, just
Mhm.
short of the Art Ross. And of course, I spoke about it earlier in the week about how we have to temper our expectations a little lower as far as regular season success. But again, the more cracks you have at it, the more opportunities you have to hopefully hoist the cup.
Yeah, and that's all, a fan could ask for is, once you get into the dance or, the top eight, anything can happen. I think teams in the past have shown that, but those teams has also shown the resolve to really grind down and dig deep and really play a certain way when it matters. Unfortunately, last season, Florida was all run and gun and, let's go down 4 or 5 goals and, let's come back in epic fashion. But hopefully that changes this season. Hopefully it'll be a more of a complete game, more defensively minded, and that they can show that they can change instead of waiting for 70 games to pass and then decide to implement more of a defensive side of the game. But, that's why they brought in Paul Maurice. That's why they've signed the players that they have, more depth players. And I'm kind of, excited to kind of see, what the makeup of the team is going to be. I mean, you have a couple of storylines coming in. Is Huberdeau going to sign a contract extension? What's going to happen with Mackenzie Weegar? How is Duke not being in the lineup for the first half of the season going to affect the team? So, a couple of things to look out for, but hopefully, as, the offseason, turns out, we'll get more answers and we'll be able to see the development of younger players too that hopefully can step in and make an impact, kind of like Anton Lundell did last season.
And also, I think of where I think about how some of the rumor mill was going around last week about how people might have seen the Florida Panthers regular season, and you spoke about it, how going behind 4 or 5 goals and then coming back to win, but also the amount of overtime games that they had to win as well in the regular season. And of course, 3-on-3 hockey with the Florida Panthers roster and their speed and just overall talent and more ice opened up. When you look at that, it's not to toot our own horns of the team that we cheer for, but it's not a surprise seeing the amount of wins. But of course, all those minutes accumulated from all those overtime ice time over the season might have tired them out. And like you said, more of a complete game that we're looking for as far as a 60-minute game defensive style. And it's funny, I asked this earlier in the offseason with Frank, saying who are the real Florida Panthers as far as the offensive firepower that we saw in the regular season, only to switch their game to kind of a defensive style in the playoffs. And of course, the offense was just non-existent there, and the power play was top 5 just all of a sudden disappeared. Maybe we see more of that shift towards the other end. I mean, many teams have had to change their game with playoff failures. I mean, we've spoken about it all off season, but hey, less overtime games for the Panthers and more of those. I am very okay with that.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I mean, some of those overtime games were just ridiculous. I mean, I can't tell you how many saucer passes I've seen from Huberdeau to Barkov or even to Duke for game winners. It's just ridiculous how accurate and how smooth that is. I think my 2 favorite ones are one from Huberdeau from the boards, sending it to Barkov, and he goes backhand on Detroit. And then the second one, or actually my favorite one, is Huberdeau sending it over to Barkov, and Barkov just waiting out Sorokin on the Islanders and just going far post and just tapping it in, where most players would actually just take possession of the puck and try to go to the near post. That just shows you the skill level and the brain mentality that these players have. And, hopefully they can do that in the game instead of in overtime. when it matters more. And, hopefully Florida, like I said, can put more of a complete game and not have to muster more energy into overtime or shootouts.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, we the Florida Panthers saw their fair share of of almost being goal lead. We saw
Mm-hmm.
James Reimer, which one of them was the fake Michigan that Huberto had. I believe it was to Sam Bennett, if I remember
Yep.
correctly. And another one was John Gibson as well at home, and then they found a way to still get through. And hopefully we're looking more of it not getting to that point into the game. And hey, it might require less wins, but hey, this last year felt like a sprint for the Panthers all season. Now the mentality has to be marathon for this team because we don't want to see this team run out of gas.
Yeah, and I think that's got to be more of the mentality. Like, hey, we got past first round. I mean, you saw how the team reacted, and like, hey, we got over the hill that we were supposed to get over, and then unfortunately, we saw the play afterwards in the second round. Hopefully, the mentality is like, hey, we don't need to stress ourselves out during the regular season. Let's do what we need to get into the playoffs and not show our hand during the season, because that's honestly what Tampa did. Tampa seemed like they did just enough to maintain a 2 or 3 spot to get into the playoffs and then turned it on. I feel like they were kind of lucky in the first round against Toronto. Toronto played fantastic. And then they really turned it on against us. They left no stone unturned to make sure that they were going to get into the Eastern Conference Finals. But don't tire yourself out during the season. Make sure you know how you're going to play. Have that mentality. Have that that system in place so that when the playoffs start, you're ready to go.
Mm. One other thing before we transition over to segment number 2 is a signing that the Panthers had. They signed Rodolphe Balcers to a 1-year deal from San Jose, having a career high in goals last season. So Rodolphe Balcers is yet the latest signing for the Panthers. In segment number 2, we are going to discuss our way too early opening night lineup for the Florida Panthers. Nick and I are going to give our predictions on that, and we might have a few disagreements here, and that's okay. So we'll talk about that more in the next segment here on Locked On Panthers. But first, we're going to tell you all about BetOnline. And BetOnline.net is your #1 source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports development, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL offseason, and Major League Baseball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sport wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. And with the British Open going on right now, Dustin Johnson is currently leading the pack, and Rory McIlroy is set to tee off at 9:59 a.m. local time. So get your bets in at BetOnline if you are a betting person. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Second segment here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast on this Fairbanks Friday edition of the show. So Nick, this took me like a good 30 minutes to write down every single name as far as line combos of how this lineup is going to be, because you factor in Duke being placed on IR to start the season, losing Claude Giroux, losing Mason Marchment, and of course the defensive pairings were a little easier because of the amount of people under contract, goalies of course. But I'm going to start off with let's break this in half as far as the forwards. Let's start off with the top 6. My top 6 as far as forwards: Barkov with Verhaeghe and Sam Reinhart on the top line right now. Second line, Sam Bennett, Huberto on the left. And this is one I did not think we were going to see a few weeks ago. From fourth line right wing to second line, at least to start the season, Patrick Hornquist. What says you about that opening top six as far as that. Who do you have in the top six opening night?
So that kind of threw me for a curve. Not gonna lie. So first line, you gotta obviously keep Verhage or Swaggy and Barkov together. They had that gelling together. This might throw you. I'm putting Denisenko on the first line to start opening night. I think he has something. Yeah, I believe that this is his time to kind of prove what he has to offer, and this might be one of his last chances because I know he was rumored to be in packages for Claude Giroux last year. So let's see. And then on the second line, I have Huberdeau, Sam Bennett, and Colin White.
Okay. I do have Denisenko making the opening night lineup, but I do not have him. I have him as a scratch for opening night, but he's going to get his opportunities to play for this year. So there you might interchange him with Lomberg, Rodolphe Balsers, and I'm gonna and one other, which I'm gonna wait until when I read the bottom six. All right, third bottom six: Anton Lundell. On his left wing, Nick Cousins. And on his right, Colin White.
Okay.
With the fourth line being Eetu Luostarinen, Rodolphe Balsers, and Cole Schwitt. And because Anthony Duclair will start the season on IR, you're gonna have to replace Duke with somebody on the lineup. So I put Cole Schwitt in that position. So my scratches for opening night would be Lomberg, Lucas Carlson, and Denisenko. And the reason why I have Patrick Hornquist on that second line for now, and that could change later in the season. I think you said you had Colin White on line number 2 and Denisenko on number 1. Yes. I think as far as the trust with that team, I think in the beginning of the season there's going to be a little bit of okay, these guys are familiar with each other, so let me put Hornquist in that second line for now.
I understand where you're coming with that. My big thing about Hornquist right now is his speed and what he's going to be able to do on the second line. Now you're going to have Hubie basically controlling the play, and you're going to have Bennett, who is going to be like Trocheck, and he's going to drive the play either with a puck or he's going to go straight to the net. And that really makes you wonder what Hornquist is going to do because Bennett's kind of taking his spot. So I'd rather have Colin White, who's more of a speedy winger, kind of help out the play with that. So my bottom six, I have Anton Lundell, Nick Cousins on the left, and I have Reinhart on the right, kind of keeping them paired together, keeping that chemistry going, because I think Lundell needs that, and then also having another veteran winger in Cousins. And then my fourth line, I do have E2D2 or E2 Luostarinen, Lomberg, and Patrick Hornquist. So I think that line has been together. I think that they could definitely do some damage as far as like wearing down an opponent. I think E2 Luostarinen had a great playoff, and I think he proved himself to be a bottom line centerman. And then my scratches are actually going to be Heponiemi, Balsers, and the new Finnish player that they picked up, Lepchi.
I didn't even have Lepchi or Heponiemi making the opening night roster, but still plenty of opportunities for. They're going to really fight it out in camp. So
yep.
And listen. The right side, the wing, the right wing position is really going to be the hardest part to predict in this lineup. And if Andrew Burnett were still the coach of this team, I could really see Patrick Hornquist staying on that fourth line with in the bottom, and I could see Rhino still being paired up with Anton Lundell. But I think with a system change, we could very well see in the beginning Hornquist being in the second line at least in the beginning. Defense pairings, I don't think there's much of a debate with this. Uyghur Ekblad to at least start the season, Forsling Montour, and then Mark Stahl and Radko Gudas. I'm not sure if there will be any disagreements there. What says you about that opening night roster as far as the D pairings?
Yeah, I think it will be Ekblad and Uyghur, but I do have a feeling that Maurice is going to split them up. So, I mean, I will stick with Uyghur and Ekblad. This one, I am going to make a switch. I do think it is going to be Forsling and Gudis on the second pairing, even though Gudis kind of was towards the end of the season and in the playoffs was kind of showing his age a little bit. And then I'm actually going to go, who else do we got here? I'm probably going to go with Lucas Carlson and Brandon Montour on the third pairing with Mark Stahl being the scratch or the seventh D man.
Yeah, and there's let's also not forget that they do have a defenseman on that they signed to an ELC earlier in the offseason in Cal Sajan. So they have an opportunity to bring him up and down. So Carlson could be fighting with Sajan for that seventh defenseman spot in the lineup. So lots of camp battles in order to determine who's going to make this lineup. And competition's a great thing for this team. We had a whole bunch in the last few years, and the great thing about it is the opening night roster for this team. The majority of the team is still there. Of course, there's no Marchment there, and we're just comparing opening night roster. They're still coming off a trade of just acquiring Sam Reinhart, and Sam Reinhart. Remember what was said in the first 6 games of the season about Sam Reinhart? 1 point in 6 games, and then he was basically a point a game player the rest of the way. So I think I think with the comfort that Sam Reinhart has with this team now, I think we're going to see an even better start for Rhino come opening night next season.
I certainly hope so. I mean, I do believe in the adage that there are some players that do start slow. I mean, you see it in baseball where there's just some players that do not like playing in the cold. I guess that's just something that I've noticed being from Chicago, some players being for the White Sox or the Cubs that for whatever reason, the month of April just doesn't work. They don't like the cold. So it'll be interesting to see how Rhino actually adapts to being with the team after a year and see if he comes out with the same fire that he did towards the later part of the season, scoring a lot of goals and assisting on a lot of power play opportunities. But it'll just, to me, it's going to be interesting how the lines are going to be juggled, what Maurice has planned, because he did say he didn't want to put a cap or put a brakes on the offense and everything. So, maybe he doesn't change it up too much, but maybe he changes up the defense a little bit to make sure that the structure is there and they're minding their gaps a little bit better than they did.
And of course, this goes without being said as well as goalies Bobrovsky and Knight, same thing as last season, as to fill out the lineup. So in the next segment, we are going to discuss our way too early playoff predictions for the Eastern Conference ahead on this Fairbanks Friday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Third and final segment here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. I'm Armando Velez. I got Nick Fairbanks here from PantherParkway.com on this Fairbanks Friday edition of the show. And Nick, here's some betting odds actually for the Panthers. I mean, I know free agency was a really tough day to swallow, and it felt like the sky was falling for the Panthers a bit. And there were even some people who were saying that the Florida Panthers are not going to make the playoffs next year because they lost all these pieces. Relax, everybody. So betting odds, as far as multiple resources out there, still have Florida in the top 5 of betting odds to win the Stanley Cup. Vegas Insider has it at plus 1,100. BetMGM plus 1,000. Caesars Sportsbook plus 1,200, DraftKings 850, FanDuel 13 plus 1,300. So there's still many opportunities there. Weirdly, our own sponsor BetOnline doesn't have NHL futures just yet. So we'll update you. We'll update it as it gets closer to the season. But if the betting lines still have Florida in the top 5, it's a little harder when we are covering this every single day, and it's our team thinking that the sky is quote unquote falling. Sometimes we got to take a little bit of a step back and say, this is still a good team.
It is, and I'm going to be 100% honest. I've only bet maybe once in my life. I mean, I do fantasy football and everything, and I understand that that's a form of betting, but not in the same respect of, putting up odds and everything. But the odds don't really matter to me. I mean, I know Colorado was the favorite last season, and, it proved to be, the right bet. But I think with hockey, there's so many variables and so many things that go into it. This league has so much parity that, you could probably lay a bet on any team and, you'd probably have, you could really, end up winning a lot of money, or you could be like me when you bet the Panthers a couple seasons ago and win absolutely nothing. I think they barely made the playoffs that season. So it just goes to show you that, the league, you have to really know something, or you really have to really believe in the team that you're putting money on in order to do that. But as far as the playoffs go, to be honest, I really don't see much change in some of the teams that are going to be in the playoffs next season. So I'm actually kind of interested to see, what teams you have in the East, if any change at all.
Let's start easy.
Okay.
With our own division that the Panthers play in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's much change as far as Toronto, Florida, and Tampa Bay. I think that I could very well see the Tampa Bay Lightning winning the division, and it could be Florida, Toronto in round 1. I'm not sure if Toronto is a division champion next year, especially with their goalie situation. Matt Murray does have a better defense in front of him. Mm-hmm. But that goalie situation in Toronto is like still a very big question mark. So I still think those are the 3 teams in the Atlantic.
Yeah, kind of confusing that they didn't want to pay Campbell $5 million, yet they're going to pay Matt Murray and I think Ilya Samsonov the same amount of money to be their backstop. So I don't know. I would have trusted Campbell, giving him the money to, just solidify that position. But, starting with our division, I do have the Leafs winning the division just because I think that they could play the style that the Panthers are playing all season, where they can outscore everybody. And they could, it doesn't matter. So I think that they can outscore their problems. And then I do have the Tampa Bay Lightning as a 2nd seed. And then I do have the Panthers coming in the 3rd seed. So you could definitely see a Florida and Tampa series in the first round once again. And to round it out, I do see Boston squeaking in again. I know that, towards the end of the season, when they got rid of their coach, they didn't know Bergeron was coming back. They didn't know who was going to be on the team, but it sounds like Krejci's coming back. Boston, for whatever reason, just will never go away. So I'm going to put them as the final team in the Atlantic to make the playoffs.
I don't have Boston in.
That's fine.
I have a different one. So let's start with the Metro for who could be in. Carolina had a great offseason. Even though it's funny because they got Max Pacioretty for basically nothing, got some draft picks for Tony DeAngelo's deal. They also got Brett Burns as well, a veteran on their team. So they got some experience along with getting some draft capital back, and they got a former captain as part of their team. Pittsburgh, I know they're getting older, but they never, ever go away. 16 straight years in the postseason. I don't know what NHL hockey is without seeing Malkin, Letang, and Crosby together making the postseason. I don't think they win a playoff round, but I think they're still going to be in. And I think this team is primed to make a comeback after the season that they had last year in the New York Islanders, especially if they have a chance to sign Nazem Kadri. They still have the cap space, and and the New York Islanders don't have that many expiring contracts, and with a lot of cap space to go with it, that they can sign Matt Barzal even next season. So I think that is a good opportunity for the New York Islanders to and of course of course with the injuries and their arena situation with the road games that they had early in the season, I think that they're primed to make another run back. And I don't have Washington making the playoffs next year.
So I think that's honestly where we're going to differ. These are in no order, but I do have Pittsburgh because I put them on the level of Boston. Like you said, they just never go away. They always find a way, or they always exceed expectations. I do have the New York Rangers back in it. I don't think Gerard Gallant is going to allow that team to back down after their successful season. I think they're going to make the playoffs once again. Obviously, you can't leave out Carolina because that's another team that just consistently makes the playoffs and makes some noise. And I do have the Washington Capitals making the playoffs again. I know that Nick Backstrom's probably not going to be playing maybe at all this season just because of the injuries that he has. But I think the fact that you have Alex Ovechkin in there, you have some other players that they just signed that I think will help them. And I think the fact that they were able to play the Panthers so well in the first period or the first round of the playoffs last season kind of showed them that, hey, like maybe we don't need to be, we don't have to score as much as we do. And we can actually play more of a defensive, tough game, and they can grind that out during the season. So I don't think the Islanders are going to make it because I don't see them having enough firepower. I think they put a lot of their eggs in the basket for Johnny Gaudreau, and they just couldn't make it happen. And on top of that, I think their goaltending outside of Sorokin is going to be, suspect. And their defense, let's see what happens. I mean, they built a really good top six, but at the same time, if they're not scoring goals, then what's going to happen with that team.
Mm-hmm. And this is me just thinking that Nazem Kadri could get to New York, hopefully for him and him getting his payday. It's funny because a team out west that still hasn't really spent that needs to get to the cap floor is Anaheim. And could they be in on someone like John Klimberg or even Nazem Kadri? But but Nazem Kadri wants to win. I know he has a cup, so he wants to win. As far as I don't have, I told you I don't have Washington making it because also Tom Wilson's not going to be playing for a while. Even though they did get Darcy Kemper didn't look the best in the playoffs, but also prior to being on the Colorado Avalanche, Darcy Kemper was actually pretty good for being on a really bad Arizona Coyotes team. So maybe this is a position for Darcy Kemper to even have a better individual season this year on a better, well, not a better team, but now that he has his payday, so maybe that's an opportunity for Kemper. As far as wild card spots, New York's strange for me. I still think they're in. I just think that Vincent Trocheck deal is going to be hurt later on in the contract. In the beginning, I think it's a better replacement for Andrew Kopp for them. Mm-hmm. I still think Detroit is going to fall short of the playoffs for at least for one more season. My last team in, and I think I might be drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit too hard on this one. I think the Ottawa Senators could make it in that last spot, and I think I'm not sure if it's hype for everything, all the moves that they're doing, but Pierre Dorion might have accelerated and their rebuild, and what he said last season about the rebuild being over, it might very well be.
I gotta word this the right way, but it probably helps that there's probably a different ownership group or a different person at the helm right now that's going to allow him to do the things that he needs to do in order to put the franchise a good product on the ice. So the fact that they were able to sign like Claude Giroux, they're able to trade for DeBrincat, which was a steal in my opinion. The fact that Brandon Hagel garnered more than DeBrincat, a 40 goal scorer, is crazy to me. So you have these pieces, and we talked about it, that they could be a sleeper team. Absolutely. I honestly could see them battling it out for a last playoff spot. Detroit is still a year or two away. I mean, as Steve Yzerman said that, they asked him how far are you away in the rebuild? And he's like, well, I had a 5-year plan and we're in year 3. We're in year 3. Like that, he was deadpan just saying that, just making sure that everybody understood, like, hey, we're still building, but I did put some pieces together to kind of accelerate, where the forwards need to be. So, as far as the wild cards go, yeah, I do have Boston. I do have the Capitals in those spots. So I know I'd mentioned them already, but I have a feeling as those teams get older and everything, it's going to be harder for them to keep up with the top 3 teams in those divisions.
Mm-hmm. And the Senators just yesterday extended Josh Norris, and you look at that trade with Ottawa and San Jose, and it looks worse and worse every day. And Timmy Stützle is part of it. It's funny, Rodolphe Balcers was part of that trade as well. He was placed on waivers from Ottawa and then reclaimed by San Jose, so he went back for a second stint with them. So of course, San Jose will take their victory laps where they can get them. But that trade, man, and which ended up being the 3rd overall pick, and then the awful contract that San Jose has with Erik Karlsson, who's basically at this point in his career playing with one leg. It's just looking like a great trade. And you, like you said, a steal with the DeBrincat trade. And you talked about Brandon Hagel getting more of a return than DeBrincat. I think of another trade just last offseason with Buffalo about how they got more for Rasmus Ristolainen that they did for Sam Reinhart as well. So it's funny because us fans on the outside see how is this player getting more of a return than this? It's like you wonder if these GMs are looking back at their own previous trades and say, hey, I got to trade for this X player. My expectations are going to continue to be here.
Yeah, and I also think that the trade deadline also drives prices up. Obviously, it was a buyer's market last trade deadline. So I can understand where Brandon Hagel got a little bit more because it was in a pinch, it was in a vacuum where Tampa wanted to make the deal, and now did Chicago have to trade DeBrincat? Did they have to? Could they have held on to him for another season, or at least sign him to maybe another bridge deal to get him over to see if he was going to be a part of the core going forward? But I think it allowed other teams to kind of basically dwindle down that asking price, saying, "Hey, yeah, we'll trade you the 7th overall pick or whatever, and a couple of other prospects or picks and everything." But maybe you should have traded him at the trade deadline. He would have got a ton for him. But at the same time, past is the past, and Chicago's tearing it completely down. They're going for the 1st overall pick next season, and this is probably the best way to do it.
Here's another thing. You talk about asking price being higher around the trade deadline because emotions get in the way when there's games being played, and you're seeing what's ahead. While you're in the offseason, you still have a few months to get some practices in, battle it out in camp. Talk to these agents more when things are more slowed down, so the asking prices might not be as high. And who knows, they could have held on to DeBrincat at least for next trade deadline as well. I mean, he had a little bit of he doesn't need to have an extension just yet neither. So I don't know what Kyle Davidson is thinking as far as, is this going to be the highest that the asking price is going to be? Because when you're in the middle of trade deadline season, not all the picks are set in stone. And Kyle Davidson was looking, of course, for a top 15, top 5 pick. And of course, it didn't go well with New Jersey as far as trying to trade with them. And it's crazy because once again, those draft picks are not set in stone and emotions get high.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw it with Bill Zito. He put all his chips in and he went for it. So that was the emotion, that was the intent, that was the mindset that he had. And I'm pretty sure other GMs had that in mind too. I mean, Tampa Bay took on Hagel and they gave up a lot for him. And, he did pay off, in the regular season and a little bit in the playoffs. But, um, you know, it's kind of like a reset in the offseason. Yeah, you're going to spend a lot of money on free agents because you're negotiating against other teams, but you're not negotiating against another GM as far as like what you're going to give up for a player to win the cup. It's a little bit more modest. So it's just interesting to me when you see a trade happen in the offseason, you start to think like, hey, maybe the GMs thought that they could get more, and then when cooler heads prevailed, no, they probably walked off their asking price just because nobody else was going to give them the package that they were going to get during the trade deadline. Which, to be honest with you, if I was a GM and I was looking to rebuild, I'd be looking to trade probably most of my high end players during the trade deadline and to solidify getting more prospects and more picks to take advantage of that emotion or for those teams that are going for it.
Mm. And next trade deadline, we are on Patrick Kane watch. That's for sure. That's the biggest name. That's for sure. But Nick, I want to thank you for joining on this Fairbanks Friday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. Tell everybody where they can find you online.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on. It's great to be back from the IR. Everybody can follow me at Prudentious0 on Twitter, and also can follow my work on PantherParkway.com. So Armando, thank you again for having me back.
Absolutely, and I'll see you next Friday.
Yes, sir.
And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast so you'll be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to Locked On Fantasy Hockey with Flip Livingstone and Studio Roden. We'll be covering all the offseason activities around the National Hockey League. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. And for your second listen of the day, make sure to listen to today's episode of Locked On NHL. Locked On experts give you a 30-minute podcast on all things NHL all year long. Stay up to date on everything in the hockey world. Locked On NHL, your daily 30-minute NHL podcast. So I'm Armando Velez with Nick Fairbanks. And you've been listening to Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're your team every day.